The woman who abandoned her poor husband and twin daughters for a wealthy man never imagined she would ever see him again. But 20 years later, 4 black SUVs rolled slowly into Okafor village, and the man stepping out of the lead vehicle was no longer the struggling tailor she had once walked away from. He was now one of the most powerful industrialists in East Africa. His name was Emeka Dike. In the moment Ngozi saw his face across the road, her shopping basket slipped from her fingers, and 20 years of choices, luxury, loneliness, and regret came crashing down on her like a collapsing wall. The red dust of Okafor had barely settled when the convoy appeared over the hill. 4 black SUVs moved in formation down the narrow village road, their polished surfaces catching the afternoon sun like 4 moving mirrors. Women who had been balancing baskets on their heads stopped walking entirely. Market traders who had been arguing over prices fell silent. Young men who had been lounging against the fence of the old community hall stood upright without knowing why. Children were the first to run toward the sound, small feet slapping against the warm red earth, voices rising with excitement. Big cars are coming! From the open rear window of the lead vehicle, a tall man looked out quietly. His eyes moved slowly across the familiar landscape, the cracked plaster walls of the market stalls, the ancient mango tree beside the community well whose roots had broken through the concrete long ago, the rusted corrugated roof of the village primary school where he had once dropped off 2 small daughters in second-hand uniforms. His jaw was set. His eyes were calm, not cold, but deeply settled, the way a man's eyes become when he has survived everything that was designed to destroy him. He wore a charcoal gray agbada, tailored with quiet precision, no unnecessary decoration, no visible flash, just a man who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. His name was Emeka Dike, and this village had not seen him in 20 years. Across the road, near the entrance of the old open market, where tomatoes and yams and dried fish were laid on wooden tables beneath faded umbrellas, a woman stood, completely still. She had recognized the shape of his shoulders before the window had even come into full view. Her body understood what her mind was still refusing to process. Her name was Ngozi. Once she had been his wife, the mother of his children, the woman who sat across from him in a small wooden table in a small compound and told herself that love was enough, until she decided it wasn't. She had left him on a quiet Tuesday morning 20 years ago, while he was at his tailoring workshop and their twin daughters were still sleeping. She had not said goodbye, not to him, not to the girls. And now the man she had abandoned, the man she had once called a good man going nowhere, was returning to Okafor village in a convoy that had already drawn more attention than anything this community had seen in a decade. Ngozi's hands were shaking. She did not move. Before this story takes you any deeper, tell me in the comments which country are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? And if stories of betrayal, justice, sacrifice, and powerful comebacks move your heart, subscribe to this channel right now, because Emeka's story is only just beginning, and what happens next will change the way you think about struggle, patience, and the price of choice.
20 years earlier, the world before the break. The village of Oguta in southeastern Nigeria was the kind of place that did not rush. Mornings arrived with the slow crow of roosters and the low, steady sound of women coaxing cooking fires to life in the gray hour before sunrise. The air in Oguta smelled of damp red earth and palm kernel oil and wood smoke. Afternoons stretched long and unhurried. Evenings brought the sound of children's laughter threading between the compound walls, like music no one had arranged, but everyone recognized. Emeka Dike was a tailor. Not a fashion designer, not a boutique owner, a tailor, the kind that sat behind a hand-operated sewing machine in a modest workshop and produced work that was better than his circumstances suggested it should be. His shop was a single room with a corrugated iron roof that drummed magnificently during heavy rain. 2 sewing machines sat against one wall. A dress mannequin stood in the corner wearing whatever he was currently working on, and a long cutting table ran down the center of the room. Above the door, a wooden sign he had painted himself read, "Emeka Tailoring, Quality Work, Fair Price." He had made that sign 7 years earlier, on the first day the workshop opened. He had been proud of it then. He was still proud of it, in the quiet, stubborn way people are proud of things they built from nothing. People in Oguta trusted Emeka's hands. When Chief Okonwo needed a new ceremonial wrapper in Agbada for the new Yam Festival, he brought his finest imported fabric to Emeka, not to the more modern tailor in the market square, but to Emeka, because Emeka's finishing work had never disappointed. When the St. Matthew's Anglican Church needed new choir robes, the pastor climbed onto a motorcycle and came directly to Emeka's workshop. He had a gift. But in Oguta, as in many small places, a gift was not always enough. Every evening, when the workshop was locked and the day's dust had settled on Emeka's shoulders, he walked home along the path between the palm trees. Chisom was always first. She had been first in the delivery room, arriving 6 minutes before her twin sister, and she had apparently decided that being first was simply her permanent position in life. She came at full speed, every time, no hesitation, arms already extended, fully trusting that her father would catch her before she hit the ground. He always did. Araese came behind her at a slightly more measured pace, not slower from fear, but from observation. At 5 years old, Araese had the quality of someone who was gathering information. She noticed things, the slight tension in her father's shoulders that meant a difficult day, the particular way he smiled when he was genuinely happy versus when he was simply performing happiness for their benefit. Where Chisom met the world by running directly into it, Araese met the world by watching it very carefully first. They were completely different. They were completely inseparable. Emeka would catch Chisom with his right arm, extend his left hand to Araese, and for a few minutes, just a few, the long mathematics of unpaid school fees and insufficient income completely disappeared. The world became very simple. 2 small girls who believed their father was invincible. He worked very hard to deserve that belief. Not everyone in the DK compound shared those quiet evening moments. Inside the main house, Ngozi DK moved through her evenings with the energy of someone who had already half left the room she was standing in. She had been beautiful when Emeka married her, still was by the judgment of anyone who looked, tall, smooth-skinned, with high cheekbones that caught lights the way well-cut fabric catches it. She carried herself with the natural elegance of someone who grew up being noticed. In those early years, Ngozi had believed in the life they were building together. Emeka was kind, consistent, honest. He never raised his voice. He never stopped working. When the twins arrived, he had wept quietly in the hallway corridor, not from fear, but from an emotion so full that it had simply overflowed. She loved him. She was sure of that much, even years later. But love, she had slowly learned, did not pay for school uniforms twice a year. Love did not keep the generator running during rainy season. Love did not silence the voice of her elder sister Ada in Lagos, who called every Sunday afternoon and filled the phone with casual references to her husband's new company car, their planned vacation to Dubai, the kitchen renovation that was nearly complete. Ada never boasted directly. She was too intelligent for that. She simply described her life and let the distance between that description and Ngozi's own reality do the work. "How are things in Oguta?" Ada would ask, in the gentle tone of someone who already knew and was simply being polite.
"We're managing," Ngozi would reply, and Ada would say, "Good, good, that's all that matters," in a voice that somehow made managing sound like slow drowning. Ngozi had begun dreaming differently. Not big, abstract dreams, but specific, dangerous ones, the kind that attach themselves to real people and real possibilities.
3 weeks after Ngozi's inner restlessness had quietly crossed from frustration into something more purposeful, a visitor arrived in Oguta. Mr. Roland Ose did not look like a man who changed lives. He arrived in a single silver saloon car with a quiet driver and a leather briefcase. He was Ghanaian Nigerian, in his early 50s, with the calm demeanor of someone who made significant decisions without much visible drama. He had come to the region on behalf of a textile and fashion retail company he owned, a mid-range chain with ambitions to expand across West Africa, and a current shortage of reliable craftsmen who could produce garments at volume without sacrificing quality. When he reached Emeka's workshop, he stopped talking and started looking. He picked up a suit jacket Emeka had completed that morning. He examined the collar construction. He turned it inside out and studied the lining. He held it to the window light and looked at the stitching along the lapel. He set the jacket down. "You did all of this yourself?" "Yes, sir." "The lining technique, where did you learn that?" "My master in Onitsha taught me the basics, but that particular finish, I developed it myself. It keeps the jacket from pulling at the shoulder when the wearer moves." Mr. Ose looked at him steadily. Then he placed a business card on the cutting table. 60 pieces, corporate shirts and suit jackets, delivery to Abuja, end of next quarter. Emeka looked at the card. 60 pieces was more production than he typically achieved in 6 months. "I can do it," he said. Mr. Ose studied him. "My chain has 14 locations. If this first delivery is excellent, I will need you again, regularly." After the man left, Emeka stood alone in his workshop for several minutes, looking at the business card in his hand. 14 locations, 60 pieces, the possibility of regular orders. A door, not thrown open, but definitely unlocked. For the first time in years, the future felt wider than the village. That evening, he told Ngozi everything. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked a single, precise question. "How much will he pay?" When he told her the figure, Ngozi nodded slowly and said, "Good." Nothing more. She went back to stirring the pot on the stove. He did not notice that she had not looked at him once while he spoke. He did not notice much later that night the glow of her phone screen in the darkness as she typed a long message to someone whose name he had never heard. The arrival of Chief Benson Eze. He had appeared in Ngozi's life 6 months earlier at a cousin's traditional wedding in Enugu. Chief Benson Eze was 57 years old, recently widowed, and built with the particular solidity of a man who had never once been uncertain of his place in any room. He owned a logistics company, 2 properties in Enugu, and a weekend house in Abuja. He wore his wealth the way comfortable men wear old clothes, without effort, without announcement, but impossible to miss. He had sat near Ngozi's family section at the wedding. They had spoken briefly during the food service. He had said something that made her laugh, genuinely, not politely. Before the evening ended, he had quietly passed her his number. Ngozi had not called or replied for months, but the number had stayed in her phone. And after months of Sunday calls from Ada, after months of watching Emeka come home with just enough, always just enough, never more, she finally opened the message thread and typed 2 words, "I remember." What followed moved the way dangerous things do, gradually, then all at once.
Chief Benson Eze began visiting nearby towns on what he called business. Ngozi began finding reasons to go to the market on those same days. First, they met for 30 minutes at a roadside restaurant, then for 2 hours, then an entire afternoon. He never rushed her. That was the particular skill of men like him. He simply made the alternative feel warmer, safer, more inevitable. He described his Enugu house in detail, the polished marble floors, the generator that ran so smoothly you only knew it was on by the coolness of the air conditioning, the housekeeper who prepared fresh meals every morning. "You were not made for struggling," he told her one afternoon, without drama, as though it were simply an observable fact. Ngozi looked at her hands when he said it, and inside her, something that had been leaning for a long time finally tipped. It was a Tuesday. Emeka rose before sunrise, as he always did when a large order was waiting. He dressed quietly in the dark. He stood briefly over the girls' sleeping mats, Chisom sprawled with one arm flung wide, Adayese curled neatly on her side, and pressed his lips to each of their foreheads without waking them. He made tea. He drank it standing at the kitchen window, watching the compound lighten slowly as dawn approached. Then he picked up his workshop keys and left. Ngozi lay still in the bed until she heard the gate close. Then she sat up. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times in her mind that the actual doing of it felt almost separate from herself. She pulled a single bag from the top of the wardrobe. She packed her good clothes, her documents, the envelope of money she had been quietly setting aside over 3 months. She did not pack everything, only what she needed, only what she could carry without it looking like what it was. At the door of the twins' room, she stopped. Chisom had rolled onto her back in sleep, one arm flung wide as though reaching for something. Adayese was curled on her side, her small breathing soft and even, and her small face peaceful in the pale morning light. They were 5 years old. Ngozi stood in that doorway for what felt like a long time. A sound formed at the back of her throat, something between a word and a cry, but she pressed her lips together, and it did not come out. She told herself, "Children are resilient. They are young. They will adapt. They will be better off somewhere stable." These were the sentences she had prepared. She recited them now silently in the doorway of her daughter's room, looking at 2 sleeping faces she had watched every night since the moment they arrived in the world. Then she turned and walked out of the compound. Chief Benson Eze's driver was waiting at the far end of the road, engine running, out of sight of the gate. The door car opened. She settled into the back seat. The door closed with a quiet, final click. The vehicle pulled away.
Emeka returned at midday. The compound was quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a house resting, but a particular, hollow quiet that a person can feel before they understand why. Ngozi? Nothing. He walked through the sitting room, the kitchen, the bedroom. The wardrobe door was slightly open. He looked at it, looked inside. Half empty. He stood very still. Then small footsteps behind him. "Daddy?" He turned. Chisom stood in the doorway, hair still slightly flat from sleep. Adayese appeared beside her a moment later, her eyes moving between her father's face and the open wardrobe with the particular quiet intelligence that was already her defining quality. "Where is Mama?" Chisom asked. Emeka looked at his daughters, these 2 small people who had run toward him every evening for 5 years with complete and unlimited trust. He walked to them. He lowered himself to his knees so their eyes were level with his. "Mama has gone on a journey," he said carefully. When is she coming back?" Emeka pulled both girls into his arms. "I don't know," he said quietly into their hair. "But I am here. I am not going anywhere. Do you understand me? I am not going anywhere." Chisom held him tightly. Adaize pressed her face into his shoulder and said nothing at all. Outside, the afternoon went on without ceremony. The sun continued its patient movement across the Oguta sky. Somewhere down the red road, the sound of a motorcycle engine had long since disappeared into the distance. And in a small compound with a tailor's workshop beside the gate, a man knelt on the floor holding his twin daughters and understood that the life he had known had just ended, and that the life that came next depended entirely on the choices he made in the days that followed. He did not know in that moment what those choices would eventually produce. He only knew that two small girls were holding on to him as though he were the last solid thing in the world. So he held them back. Not today. Not ever. The day after Ngozi left, Oguta woke up as it always did. Roosters, cooking fires, the distant sound of a motorcycle on the main road, the ordinary machinery of village life moving forward without asking anyone's permission. Inside the Dike compound, however, the morning felt entirely different. Emeka had not slept. He had sat in the wooden chair beside the bedroom window through the entire night, not moving, not eating, simply sitting with the weight of what had happened pressed flat against his chest like a stone. At some point around 3 a.m, Chisom had appeared in the doorway. "Daddy, why are you sitting in the dark?" "I'm just thinking," he said. She walked across the room and climbed onto his lap without being invited. She curled against him and went back to sleep within minutes. Emeka sat holding her until the sky outside turned from black to gray to the pale orange of early morning. Then he stood carefully, carried Chisom back to her mat, watched both daughters sleep for a long moment, and walked to the kitchen to make tea. He had an order to complete, 60 pieces for Mr. Roland Osei, delivery in 11 weeks, a contract that could change everything, or collapse everything if he allowed grief to swallow him. He drank his tea standing at the window. Then he picked up his workshop keys. Work, he told himself, is the only honest answer to pain. By the second day, Oguta knew. News in small villages does not travel, it simply appears, fully formed in the mouths of people who had no logical way of knowing. By the morning after Ngozi left, women at the community well were already speaking in lowered voices. By afternoon, the story had reached the market, the church compound, and the roadside mechanic shed where men gathered to drink palm wine and discuss things that were not their business. She left him just like that, left him with those two small girls, went to that big man in Unugu. I heard he has 2 houses. Chai, and Emeka is a good man, oh, a good man. The sympathy was genuine, but sympathy in a village is always accompanied by its less comfortable cousin, judgment. Emeka heard none of these conversations directly. He heard them the way a person hears rain. Not each individual drop, but the accumulated sound of it. The slight pause in a conversation when he walked into a shop. The over-careful kindness of neighbors who brought food to the compound in the first week. He said nothing. He accepted the food because the girls needed to eat, and his hands were occupied with the order. He greeted people with the same steady courtesy he had always used. He did not explain himself, defend himself, or invite anyone into his grief. He simply kept working. And he kept showing up for his daughters every single evening, without fail.
In the weeks after their mother left, the twins responded to the absence in the ways that their individual natures dictated. Chisom became louder, more physical, more insistent on her father's attention.
She had always been the one who ran at the world without hesitation, and now she ran at her father, demanding piggyback rides, asking endless questions, requiring his presence at every small task with an urgency that was transparent in its real purpose. She needed to confirm, repeatedly, that he was still there. Emeka understood this. He gave the rides, answered the questions, confirmed his presence every time she needed confirmation. Adieze went the other direction. She became quieter, not withdrawn, not unhappy, but deeply observant in a way that was sometimes unsettling in a child her age. She would sit beside Emeka in the workshop after school and watch his hands move across the fabric without speaking for long stretches. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after Ngozi left, Adieze said something that stopped Emeka's hands on the sewing machine. "Daddy." "Is Mama coming back?" He stopped sewing. He set down the fabric. He turned to look at his younger twin, her small face composed, her eyes asking the question directly, because she was the kind of person who preferred to know difficult things rather than wonder about them indefinitely. "I don't know," he said, honestly. "Do you want her to?" The question was so precise, so completely without sentimentality, that Emeka almost laughed, not from amusement, but from the pure, startling accuracy of it. "What I want," he said carefully, "is for you and Chisom to grow up knowing that you are loved by me every day. That is what I want." Adieze looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once with the finality of someone who has received the information they needed and filed it appropriately. Then she picked up the small square of fabric she had been practicing hemming and went back to work. Emeka turned back to his sewing machine with something unfamiliar moving through him. It took him a moment to identify it. Pride. In the first days after Ngozi left, the workshop felt impossible. But by the end of the first week, something shifted. It was not that the pain disappeared, it was that a competing force arrived. The same force that had kept him going through every difficult year before this one. A quiet, immovable stubbornness, a refusal to let the worst thing that happened to him become the final thing that defined him. He hired 2 young men from the village, Chukwu, who had some tailoring experience, and Ubina, who had none, but who was willing and fast and careful when shown how. He rearranged the workshop. He built a second cutting table from leftover lumber. He mapped out the production schedule on a large piece of cardboard tacked to the wall. He worked from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, 7 days a week. The twins were dropped at school by a neighbor woman named Mama Ifenyawa, who had 3 grown children of her own, and who had appeared at Emeka's gate the morning after Ngozi left with a pot of soup and a simple statement: "I will take the girls to school every morning until further notice. Do not argue with me." Emeka had not argued. He came home every evening for dinner with his daughters, without exception, regardless of how much work remained. He sat with them while they ate. He helped with school reading. He listened to Chisom's detailed account of everything that had happened at school that day, which was always long and somewhat tangential. He answered Adieze's more targeted questions about specific things she had observed and wanted to understand. Then he returned to the workshop. Week by week, the pile of completed pieces grew. The path to 60 pieces was not smooth. In the 4th week, the main sewing machine broke down, a component in the tension mechanism that required a spare part only available in Onitsha. Emeka sent Chukwu to Onitsha by early morning bus, paid the supplier cost from his household reserve, and in the meantime worked double shifts on the second, slower machine. He did not fall behind schedule. In the 6th week, a fabric supplier delivered the wrong weight of cotton for the shirt collars. a mistake that would have made the final garments look visibly inferior. Emeka caught it immediately during quality check. He refused the delivery, found an alternate supplier in Newi who could provide the correct weight within 3 days. He did not fall behind schedule. In the 9th week, Chukwu, the more experienced of his 2 helpers, received a job offer in Onitsha and announced he would be leaving in 4 days. Emeka sat with this information for 1 evening. Then he went to the vocational training center in the next town and returned with a young woman named Somto, who had just completed her tailoring certificate. She was faster than Chukwu on straight seams. He did not fall behind schedule. On the day of delivery, exactly on the date agreed, 60 pieces were packed in professional garment bags, labeled with care, and loaded into the vehicle that Mr. Osei's company had sent from Abuja. Mr. Osei sent his production manager instead, a precise, detail-oriented woman named Mrs. Chinyere Nwosu, who spent 90 minutes going through each piece individually before signing the documentation. She examined collar construction, lining finish, button alignment, shoulder shaping, seam tension. At the end of the 90 minutes, she closed her folder. "Mr. DK," she said, "in 4 years of working with Mr. Osei's suppliers, I have signed off on 2 deliveries that I would describe as genuinely excellent." Emeka waited. "This is one of them." She signed the form, handed him the payment envelope, and before getting back into the vehicle, she said one more thing. "Mr. Osei will call you within the week. He has a larger contract in mind. Be ready." Emeka stood in the road outside his workshop and watched the vehicle disappear. Then he looked down at the payment envelope in his hands. He walked inside. He sat at his cutting table. He placed the envelope in front of him. Then, for the first time since Ngozi had left, he allowed himself to cry. Not from grief, but from something more complicated. Relief and exhaustion in the particular emotion of a man who has refused to be finished and whose refusal has for the first time produced a tangible result. He allowed himself 3 minutes. Then he wiped his face, stood up, and began calculating what he would need to fulfill the next contract.
While Emeka worked through nights in Oguta, Ngozi was learning what the life she had chosen actually looked like from the inside. The first weeks in Onugu had felt precisely like the dream she had constructed during those long, restless nights in Oguta. Chief Benson Eze's house in the GRA neighborhood was everything his descriptions had promised. Marble floors that reflected the ceiling lights, air conditioning that ran without interruption, a bedroom larger than Emeka's entire workshop. A housekeeper named Blessing prepared breakfast every morning. Ngozi told herself this was simply what life felt like when it was not defined by shortage. But the second month introduced a different quality. Chief Eze was a busy man, more busy, she discovered, than he had appeared during those careful afternoon meetings when impressing her was his primary agenda. He left early and returned late. He traveled frequently, sometimes for 3 or 4 days at a time, without always explaining where or with whom. When he was home, he was present, but not particularly attentive. One evening, during his 3rd week of working late, Ngozi sat alone in the large living room with the television on and the sound low and realized something uncomfortable. She was bored. Not the surface boredom of an unoccupied afternoon, a deeper boredom, the boredom of a woman whose intelligence and energy had no channel, whose opinions had no forum, whose presence in this household was decorative rather than integral. She thought about the twins. This happened less often now than it had in the first weeks, but it still happened, usually at night. Usually in the particular silence of the large bedroom when Chief Eze was sleeping and the city outside was dark. Shisam's face, Adeze's eyes. She pushed the thoughts down firmly and turned her attention back to the television.
"They are fine," she told herself. "Emeka is there. Children are resilient." But the sentences were becoming harder to believe.
The call from Mr. Osei came 6 days after the delivery, as Mrs. Nwosu had said it would. The second contract was for 120 pieces, double the first. Delivery in 16 weeks. The payment was substantially larger. Emeka said yes immediately. Then he sat down and calculated, carefully and honestly, whether he could actually do it. He found a slightly larger room available for rent, 2 doors down from his current shop. He rented it for 6 months, moved his cutting operation there, and converted the original space entirely to sewing and finishing. He hired 2 more workers, bringing his team to 5, including himself and Somto. The second contract was harder than the first. When a collar error in the 7th week meant 30 collar pieces needed to be recut from reserve fabric, Emeka worked through an entire night to recover the schedule. When a delivery vehicle broke down with a partial load and the driver called from the roadside at 10 at night, Emeka hired a second vehicle from his own pocket and met the driver personally. He delivered on time. He delivered excellently. Mr. Osei called him after the second delivery and said 7 words that Emeka would remember for the rest of his life. "I want you to come to Lagos." The first time Emeka arrived in Lagos, the city nearly overwhelmed him. Not the size of it, he had expected the size. What nearly overwhelmed him was the scale of possibility he could see everywhere, in every direction. Businesses operating at volumes that made his workshop feel like a single thread in a vast loom. Mr. Osei's offices were in Victoria Island, a clean, modern space with glass walls and the faint sound of air conditioning. Emeka sat across a polished table from the man who had changed his trajectory with a single business card. Mr. Osei had a proposal. He was expanding his chain to include a mid-range to premium segment, quality corporate fashion at accessible prices to the growing Nigerian professional class. He needed a reliable, high-quality production partner, not just a supplier, a genuine manufacturing partner. You are not the biggest operation. You are currently the smallest, but your quality is the most consistent, and you solve problems without calling me. He slid a folder across the table. I want to offer you a partnership contract, 3 years renewable, minimum order volumes guaranteed, technical support for equipment upgrades, and I want to invest in expanding your production facility. Emeka opened the folder. He read the terms carefully, not quickly, not with the performed nonchalance of someone trying to appear experienced. He read each clause. He asked questions when something was unclear. He asked for 24 hours to consider before signing. Mr. Osei, who had seen many men agree too quickly to their detriment, visibly respected this. 24 hours. Then I moved to the next name on the list. Emeka spent that evening in a modest hotel room in Lagos with the folder open on the small desk, a notepad beside it, working through the numbers with the same patient precision he applied to a difficult collar construction. He called no one for advice. He trusted no instinct he had not examined first. The next morning, he returned to Mr. Osei's office and signed the contract. He shook the man's hand, and Dyke Manufacturing and Garments, which existed at that moment only as a name written on a contract, began its official existence. Time does not announce its transformations. It simply produces them, quietly, consistently, the way a river reshapes stone. 10 years after the morning Ngozi walked out of the Dyke compound, the village of Oguta looked at the Dyke family and saw something it had not predicted. It saw a man who had not broken. It saw two daughters who carried themselves with the particular confidence of young people who had been told, not just with words, but with daily consistent demonstration, that they were worth the investment of someone's entire energy. And it saw a business that outgrown the village. Emeka Dyke Manufacturing and Garments now operated from a proper production facility in Onitsha, a rented building with professional equipment, a staff of 18, a quality control process that had been formally documented, and a client list that included Mr. Osai's growing retail chain, two other corporate clients, and a recently secured contract to supply staff uniforms for a hotel group with properties in 5 Nigerian cities. Emeka was not yet wealthy by any large measure, but he was successful in the way that is more durable than sudden wealth, built layer by layer through decisions that were consistently better than the circumstances that produced them. At 15, Chisom Dyke was, by the unanimous assessment of everyone who knew her, a lot. She was brilliant in the noisy, undeniable way, the kind of student who does not simply get the right answer, but argues passionately for why it is the right answer, usually at a volume that could be heard from the corridor. Her teachers were divided into two camps, those who found her exhausting and those who found her exhilarating. Both camps agreed she was exceptional. She had her father's hands, literally. She had spent enough time in the workshop and later in the factory to understand garment construction at a technical level that surprised adult professionals. But what truly distinguished Chisom was her vision. She did not see clothing the way Emeka saw it, as precision craft executed to client specification. She saw it as statement, as culture, as the visual language that people use to tell the world who they are. "Daddy," she said one evening, looking at a factory production run of identical corporate shirts, "this is good work, but it's not interesting." Emeka replied, "The client is not paying for interesting." "But someday," Chisom said, with the serene certainty of a teenager who has not yet learned that the world pushes back, "we could be the ones deciding what interesting means." Emeka had looked at his elder daughter for a long moment, then he had gone back to his production report. But he had not forgotten what she said. Where Chisom moved through the world like a current, Adaeze moved through it like a foundation. At 15, she was the kind of student whose teachers thought about during the school holidays, not because she was the loudest or the flashiest, but because she produced work that was quietly, consistently, almost unsettlingly good. Her mathematics teacher had told Emeka at a parent meeting that Adaeze had a mind for systems. She doesn't just solve the problem, she shows you why the solution works and where it would fail if the conditions changed. In the factory, she was fascinated by the production process, not as craft, but as system. She asked questions about flow. Why did the cut pieces move in this direction before that one? What happened to throughput if the finishing station fell behind? Where were the bottlenecks? At 13, she had produced an unsolicited diagram showing how a simple rearrangement of the finishing workstations could reduce production time by an estimated 15%. Emeka took it to his factory manager. His factory manager studied it, then he implemented it. The estimate turned out to be conservative. The actual improvement was closer to 19%. Emeka placed the original diagram in a folder in his desk drawer and kept it there.
What followed the Kente capital investment was 5 years of the most concentrated growth Emeka had ever managed. The new production facility opened in Ibadan, a proper industrial building with modern equipment, 3 production lines, a design studio, a quality laboratory, and office space for a management team that now included a chief operations officer, a financial controller, and a logistics manager. Chisom enrolled in a fashion design and textile arts program in Lagos. She absorbed everything available, particularly in areas she had not explored, including design history, international fashion market structure, and the intersection of African textile traditions with contemporary fashion language.
She began developing a design portfolio that drew on Igbo and broader Nigerian visual culture, not in a superficial, decorative way, but in a deeper way that engaged with the actual meaning and structure of the visual traditions involved. Her final year project, a 12-piece collection presented at the university showcase, was covered by 2 Lagos fashion blogs in 1 print publication. The headline called her a major new voice in Nigerian fashion. She was 21. Adayese chose industrial engineering at the University of Lagos, with a specialization in manufacturing systems optimization. She interned at the Daiki facility during every vacation, applying academic frameworks to real production challenges. In her second year, she submitted a paper to an academic conference on African manufacturing. The paper was accepted. She presented it. 3 industry representatives asked for her contact details afterward. She was 19. While the Daiki family built its future in Onitsha and Ibadan, Ngozi's world in Enugu was quietly contracting. Chief Benson Eze had aged into a man that was more shadow than presence. His health had begun declining 4 years earlier, first quietly, with fatigue and shorter days, then more visibly, with hospital visits that became more frequent and more serious. As he weakened, his children's involvement in his affairs increased correspondingly. The eldest son, Chukwudi Eze, was a Lagos-based businessman who had always regarded Ngozi with the particular suspicion reserved for someone whose proximity to his father represented a potential threat to eventual inheritance. He was not hostile, he was too intelligent for hostility. He was simply present in a way that made Ngozi feel the edges of her position more sharply. She had no legal claim to the Eze estate. She had understood this from the beginning, though she had understood it more thoroughly as the years passed. When Chief Eze's condition worsened significantly, Chukwudi called a family meeting. Ngozi was invited, a courtesy, and sat at the far end of the table while the Eze children discussed their father's care arrangements, financial affairs, and the management of his properties. At one point, Chukwudi turned to her. "Auntie Ngozi, my father has made provisions for you. You will be comfortable." Comfortable, not provided for, not genuinely secured. Comfortable. She nodded. "Thank you." She sat for the rest of the meeting in the particular stillness of someone who has accepted a verdict.
It was in her 16th year in Enugu, during an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, that Ngozi heard the name. She was sitting in the back of the driver's car on the way back from a medical appointment when the radio program shifted to music to a business feature segment. And joining us now is the founder and CEO of Deek Manufacturing and Garments, which has just signed a landmark export agreement that will make it one of the first Nigerian garment manufacturers to supply premium retail chains across East Africa. Mr. Emeka Deek, welcome. Ngozi's hand stopped moving. She stared at the radio panel in the dashboard. "Thank you for having me." She recognized the voice immediately. It had been 16 years. It did not matter. She recognized it the way you recognize something that has been part of you, even the parts you have spent years trying to quiet. She listened to the entire interview, 12 minutes, during which the driver navigated traffic and assumed the passenger's silence was ordinary. Emeka spoke about the journey from the workshop in Oguta to the manufacturing facility in Ibadan. He spoke about quality as a non-negotiable principle. He was asked about his family. There was a brief pause, just a beat, almost imperceptible. "I have 2 daughters," he said. "They are the reason for all of it." The interviewer asked their names, Chisom and Adaeze. Ngozi pressed her hand flat against the car door. When she arrived home, she went directly to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in a very long time, perhaps the first time with genuine honesty rather than defensive suppression, she allowed herself to think about the compound in Oguta, the workshop, the twins asleep on their mats, the Tuesday morning, the car door closing,
and the man who had, apparently, turned every single thing she had left him with into something extraordinary. She did not pick up her phone again for a very long time. 20 years after a Tuesday morning in Oguta, Emeka made an announcement that his public relations team had described in their internal briefings as the kind of story that writes itself. Deke Manufacturing and Garments, which had grown in the intervening years into a regional manufacturing enterprise with facilities in Ibadan, Lagos, and Nairobi, a staff of over 400, and a brand identity that had achieved genuine recognition across East and West Africa, was establishing a vocational and technical training institute. The Deke Institute for Girls would offer free 2-year programs in garment manufacturing, industrial design, fashion entrepreneurship, and business management to young women from low-income rural communities across southeastern Nigeria. Scholarships would be fully funded, accommodation would be provided, graduates would receive placement support into employment and entrepreneurship programs, and the institute would be built in Oguta, the village where Emeka had spent 11 years as a tailor, struggling to pay school fees. The village where his daughters had grown up carrying the weight of abandonment alongside their textbooks. The announcement generated substantial media coverage, not just in the business press, but in national newspapers and online platforms that rarely covered manufacturing sector philanthropy. The combination of elements was undeniably compelling. Successful industrialist, humble origins, daughters now running significant parts of the enterprise, giving back to the village where the struggle had begun.
By the time of the groundbreaking, Chisom was 25 and had been formally appointed creative director of Dike Manufacturing's consumer brand division, a position she had effectively been performing for 3 years before anyone gave it a title. She had returned from a year-long working period in Dakar and Nairobi, having deepened her understanding of East and West African design traditions beyond what any single curriculum could have given her. The collection she developed following that year had been showcased at Lagos Fashion Week and covered by 2 international fashion publications. She was, in short, exactly what she had declared she would be at 15 in her father's factory. Someone who decided what interesting meant. Adeze was 25 and had recently been appointed head of operations for Dike Manufacturing's Nigerian facilities, a role that had previously required 2 separate managers, and that she had consolidated through systematic process redesign in her first 6 months. She had turned down a position at a multinational consulting firm, offering approximately 3 times her current compensation, explaining simply that, "I am not finished with what I'm building here." Emeka, for his part, had become something that had not existed as a clear category when he started, a Nigerian manufacturer with a genuinely regional footprint, built not on political connections or inherited capital, but on craft standards developed in a one-room workshop and applied with absolute consistency over 20 years. He was 52 years old. He was, by any reasonable measure, exactly what everyone in Okafor village was about to discover when the convoy arrived. Oguta had never seen anything like it. The preparations had begun 3 days earlier. Community volunteers swept the roads leading to the ceremony site. Canopies were erected. Chairs were arranged in careful rows. A small stage was built with a microphone and a podium bearing the Dike Institute logo. The village headman, Chief Emmanuel Ihejirika, who had been a young man when Emeka first opened his workshop on the main road, gathered the elders the evening before the ceremony. "We must receive him with proper honor," he said. An elder named Pa Eziokonkwo, who had been among the men who once sat under the communal tree discussing Emeka's situation after Ngozi left, quietly said, "We should have given him proper honor years ago." No one argued. The convoy appeared over the main road at 5 minutes past 10. 4 black SUVs, moving with the unhurried confidence of vehicles that were not in a hurry, because they arrived when they intended to arrive. The crowd that had gathered at the ceremony site grew immediately louder, then suddenly quieter as the vehicles came into full view. Children ran. Drummers who had been standing in small clusters began to play. Then the rear door of the lead SUV opened. Emeka Dyke stepped out. He wore a deep indigo agbada with hand-embroidered detailing at the collar and cuffs, work that any trained eye would recognize as belonging to the highest level of Nigerian tailoring craft. It had been made in his own factory, by his own senior craftspeople, to his own specifications. He stood at full height and looked around. The village, the old mango tree, the rusted roof of the primary school visible over the compound wall, the community well, the red earth road where he had walked every morning with a key in his head and a production schedule in his head. His face did not display triumph. It displayed something quieter and more complete than triumph. Return. The drumming intensified. Ululation rose from the women's section of the crowd. Chief Emmanuel Ihejirika stepped forward with both arms open. Emeka Dyke, welcome home. Thank you, Chief. Then the other doors opened. Chisom stepped out first. She always stepped out first, wearing a tailored ensemble in a bold Ankara print that she had designed herself. She looked at the village she had left as a child, and her jaw lifted slightly, not from arrogance, but from something more complex, the recognition of distance traveled. Adeze followed as she had always followed, measured, observant, her eyes moving across the crowd and the site and the stage with the systematic attention of someone who is simultaneously present and analyzing. They stood beside their father. The crowd's response was immediate and layered: recognition, admiration, and for the older villagers who remembered two small girls in second-hand uniforms, something more private, something that caught in the throat. They had grown up. They had grown up extraordinarily.
Across the ceremony area, standing slightly apart from the main gathering, near the old market entrance, Ngozi was very still. She had arrived in Aguda the previous evening, taking a private vehicle from Enugu. She had stayed at a guest house in the next town, not wanting to be known to be in Aguda before the ceremony. She had woken before dawn and lay awake listening to the sound of a village that did not know she was there. Chief Benson Eze had passed away 8 months earlier. The estate had been settled in the months following his death. His children had handled everything efficiently, as Ngozi had long known they would. She had received what had been promised, a modest apartment in a quieter part of Enugu, and a monthly allowance that was comfortable by ordinary measures, and entirely inadequate to the life she had organized herself around for 19 years. She was 53 years old. She had no children with her, no family network of her own construction, no work history of any substance, a small apartment, a life that had narrowed, year by year, from the expansive promise of that first drive into Enugu to something she could barely recognize as what she had imagined choosing. She had come to Aguda because, she told herself, she wanted to see the ceremony, to see what had happened, to see the girls she had not seen since they were 5 years old. When Emeka turned to speak to the village headman, his eyes moved briefly across the crowd, and then they stopped. He had recognized her. Not from the crowd first, from something more interior, the particular quality of stillness that existed where she stood, slightly apart from everyone else. Their eyes met. 20 years. Neither moved. Then Emeka completed his sentence to Chief Ihejirika, excused himself quietly, and began walking in her direction. The crowd noticed. Crowds always notice when two people walk toward each other with something unresolved between them. The drumming did not stop, but the conversations in the nearest circle did.
Emeka stopped a few steps from where Ngozi stood. She looked at him directly, not with the confidence she had carried out of Aguda 20 years ago, but with something that had replaced it, something rawer and more honest. "Emeka," she said. Her voice was steadier than she had expected it to be. "Ngozi." He studied her face. Time had moved through her as it moves through everyone. But what he observed most clearly was not the physical change. It was the absence of the particular restlessness that had defined her in those final Aguda years. The hunger that had made her so difficult to reach, it was gone. What had replaced it looked less comfortable, but more real. "I heard about the Institute. I came to—" She stopped, reconsidered, started again. "I don't know exactly why I came." "I think you do," he said, not unkindly. She looked down briefly, then up again. "How are they?" "Come and see for yourself." She shook her head slightly. "Ngozi," his voice was even, "I am not going to perform this for the crowd. If you came here to say something, say it to me directly." She looked at him for a long moment, then said, "I made a wrong choice. I have been carrying that for 20 years. I don't expect anything from saying it. I just needed to say it to you directly." Emeka was quiet for a moment. Then, "I know. I knew a long time ago," he continued. "What I did with that knowledge was my choice, not yours. I chose to let it make me better rather than bitter. I'm not sure I could have made that choice easily if your leaving had not made it necessary." Ngozi's eyes filled. "That is not an absolution," he said carefully. "The girls have their own feelings. That is not mine to speak for." "I know. And you cannot return to a version of that family. That version is gone." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "Then what are you asking?" She was quiet for a long moment. When she answered, the words were very small. "I don't know if I'm asking for anything. I think I'm just asking to be seen by someone who knew who I was before I made the choice that cost me everything I actually valued." Something moved in Emeka's expression. Not warmth exactly, but recognition, the acknowledgement of a human truth he understood, even across all the distance between them. "I see you," he said, "as who you are now. That is what I can offer."
Chisom saw her first. She was standing with Dr. Mensah and one of the government officials, discussing the institute curriculum when something in her peripheral vision made her turn. She saw her father and the woman he was speaking to. The recognition was not immediate. Chisom had been 5 years old, but something in the posture, in the quality of her father's attention in that conversation, made her look more carefully. Then she knew. She excused herself from the conversation and walked directly toward Adaze, who was speaking with the construction contractor near the institute markers. "Ada?" Adaze turned. She looked at Chisom's expression. She turned to look in the direction Chisom was looking. A long silence. "When did she arrive?" Adaze asked. "I don't know." "Did Daddy know she was coming?" "I don't think so." Another silence. Then Chisom said, with the particular controlled energy of someone managing a very strong response, "I want to go over there." "Chisom, I'm not going to cause a scene, but I'm not going to stand here either." Adaze looked at her sister for a moment, then she nodded once. "Then let's go together." They walked across the ceremony area side by side. The crowd, which had been half watching the exchange between Emeka and the woman they did not recognize, now turned more fully toward the approaching daughters. Emeka saw them coming. He said something brief to Ngozi. She turned. The four of them stood in a rough circle in the red dust of Oguta. The man who had stayed, the woman who had left, and the two daughters who had been caught between them. Ngozi looked at her daughters with an expression that had no rehearsed version. She had not prepared for this moment adequately because it was not possible to prepare for it adequately. "Chisom," she said. "Adaze." Chisom looked at her mother, at the face that matched, in some ways, a faint memory, not a clear one, the memory of a 5-year-old. The woman before her now was 53, with the particular look of someone who had lived inside a choice she could not undo. Chisom had prepared for this moment in the way that people prepare for things they had thought about for years without knowing when they would arrive. She had prepared anger. She had prepared distance. But looking at the woman in front of her, she found that anger required an energy she did not, in this moment, actually feel. "I don't remember you clearly," she said, finally, speaking plainly, as she always did. "I was 5. I have spent 20 years deciding whether to be angry about that or not." Ngozi said nothing. She waited. "I chose not to be," Chisom said, "because it cost me more than it cost you." Ngozi flinched, but she did not look away. Adaze spoke next. As always, she spoke less, but with precision. "We grew up fine, because our father is the person he is. That is the truth. But it is also the truth that we grew up with a space where you should have been." I paused. "We learned to live with that space. It shaped us. I'm not sure it shaped us badly, but it was there." "I know," Ngozi said. Her voice was barely above the ambient sound of the ceremony. "I am sorry. I don't offer that word easily, and I don't expect it to fix anything. I just need you to know that I have understood, for a long time, what I gave up when I made that choice." The four of them stood in silence. Then Emeka spoke, quietly, with the deliberateness of a man who had considered his words carefully before arriving at this moment. "This institute is being built for girls who are in situations we all understand from different angles. Girls who might be told that their futures are small. Girls who might be in the position of making choices under conditions that limit what they can see." He looked at Ngozi. "If you have any wisdom from the life you have lived, including the parts that went wrong, there is a place for that here. Not to restore what was, but to contribute to what is being built." He turned to the daughters. "That is my thought. The final word belongs to you two." Chisom and Adaze looked at each other, the exchange of twins who have shared their entire lives, wordless, immediate, complete in its own language. Then Chisom looked at Ngozi. "Not as our mother," she said clearly. "Not as family, as someone starting from the beginning. If you can accept those terms, honestly, without expecting more than that, then we can see." Adaze added, "The Institute will have a counseling and life skills program for girls facing difficult choices. I think," she said precisely, "someone who has lived the full consequence of a wrong choice could teach that with more honesty than someone who hasn't." Ngozi looked at her younger daughter, this composed, precise, extraordinary person who had been 5 years old and asleep on a mat the last time she saw her, and could not speak for a long moment. "I would try. That is all I can honestly offer. I would try." Adaze nodded once. "That is all we are asking."
The ceremony resumed. Officials delivered their remarks. The government representatives spoke about the Institute's role in Nigeria's vocational education agenda.
Dr. Mensah from Kente Capital spoke about the model it offered for private sector investment in human capital. Then, Emeka Dyke stepped up to the microphone. He looked out at the crowd, the village that had known him at his lowest, the journalists who had arrived to document his highest, the officials, the community members, and somewhere at the edge of it all, a woman he had once loved, sitting with the weight of a different kind of journey. He looked at his daughters in the front row. He began to speak. 20 years ago, he said, I sat in a bedroom in this village with 2 5-year-old daughters and tried to understand how to continue. The crowd was completely silent. I had a workshop. I had a skill. I had 2 children who needed their father to be more than he currently was. I had no other resources. He paused. I want to be honest with you about what those years required. They required deciding every single morning that the difficulty of the day would not be the last word. They required working when working seemed useless. They required trusting that the quality of what you build eventually speaks louder than the noise of the circumstances you build it in. He looked at the Institute's site, the bare red earth where a foundation would be poured. This institute is not a monument to my success. It is an acknowledgement of something I learned through 20 years of building, that the girls who grow up in places like Oguta are not limited by their circumstances. They are limited only by whether someone gives them the tools and the belief to see beyond those circumstances. He turned back to the crowd. My daughters are the proof of that. Not because I am exceptional, but because I refused to let exceptional circumstances, good or bad, define who we would become. He stepped back from the microphone. Applause rose through the red air of Oguta. The drummers began again, and somewhere in the crowd, an old woman named Mama Ifenua, who had taken 2 small girls to school every morning for years, and who had come today from her home specifically for this moment, pressed her hands together and closed her eyes and said something quietly to herself that no one else could hear. The ceremony lasted 3 hours. When it was over, and the canopies were being folded, and the chairs were turned to their owners, and the last journalists were gathering their equipment, Emeka stood at the edge of the Institute plot and looked at the land where the building would rise. Adeze came and stood beside him. They were quiet for a while. Daddy? Do you feel like you thought you would feel coming back? He considered the question honestly. I thought I would feel something like victory, like proving something. And I feel something quieter than that, like a circle closing, not winning, just completing. Adeze looked at the empty plot. I think that is better than victory, she said. He looked at her, this daughter who had been 5 years old and asleep and had grown into someone who understood things he was still learning. Yes, he said, I think it is. Chisom appeared from behind them, shoes dusty from crossing the site, talking on her phone and gesturing at the same time, fully inhabiting 3 separate activities simultaneously in the way that was entirely her own. She ended the call, looked at her father and sister standing together at the edge of the plot. Are you 2 being profound again? Always, Adeze said. Chisom grinned. Then she looked around at the village, at the mango tree and the school roof and the road that ran out of Oguta toward the rest of the world. We're going to build something extraordinary here. We already have, Emeka said. She looked at him, understood what he meant. Then she put her arm around him, all 5'10" of her professional designer self, and the 3 of them stood at the edge of what would become the Dyke Institute for Girls. Behind them, the village of Oguta was returning to its ordinary afternoon. Roosters, cooking fires beginning,
the sound of children somewhere doing what children do. And in the particular quality of that late afternoon light, the warm horizontal light of the dry season, the red dust of Oguta settled quietly back onto the road.
There is a truth that only time teaches, and it is this: the pain we try hardest to escape often contains the exact materials we need to build the life we were meant to live. Emeka Dike did not choose to be abandoned. He did not choose to raise twin daughters alone on a tailor's income in a small Nigerian village. He did not choose the whispers or the difficulty or the years of working while everything hurt. But he chose what to do with all of it. He chose work over bitterness, quality over excuse, his daughters over his grief, the future over the wound. And 20 years later, a man who had every reason to remain broken stood in his home village and broke ground on a school that will give other people's daughters the tools to build lives they did not believe were available to them. That is not the story of a billionaire. That is the story of a man who refused to stop. As for Ngozi, her story does not end in punishment. It ends in the particular hard grace of someone who lived long enough to understand the full cost of her choices and who was offered, not restoration, but the chance to do something honest with what remained. Justice, in the end, was not Emeka's revenge. Justice was Emeka's daughter's. If this story moved something in you, tell us in the comments. Do you believe the greatest test of a person's character is not how they succeed, but how they survive being left behind? Which country are you watching from today? Your stories matter too. If you believe in resilience, in the power of quiet discipline, in fathers who show up, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel, because the next story is already waiting, and it will stay with you.